The O Cannabis Conference and Expo returns to Toronto June 1st through the 3rd, and there's still some good booth locations available. This exciting event is free for cannabis retailers and will feature Tommy Chong receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award at the O Cannabis Industry Awards. For more information about exhibiting or to register to attend, go to ocannabis.com. That's OCANNABIZ.com. Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, capital markets analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today we've got Tyler Hurst. He's a host of the Burning Bush podcast. Tyler, thanks for being on the podcast with us.
Great, thank you, Josh.
So, what is the Burning Bush?
The Burning Bush is a podcast I started in summer of 2016 to chronicle my recovery from using 17 different psych meds over 16 years to using nothing. I'd been on Lexapro, which is the last antidepressant I was on, for 7 years, and had some serious mental health issues. We're talking blackout rages, screaming at people running down the street on Burnside on Thanksgiving. Not kidding, that really happened. And I realized later that I needed to get off my psych meds. But once I got off my psych meds, the worst possible thing that I could happen, well, at the time it seemed like the worst possible thing, I couldn't write anymore. I've been a writer since I was 14 years old, since I first joined journalism in 8th grade. I couldn't write. My brain just did not work. It just didn't work, could not understand how to type, how to tell a story. So I started the Burning Bush podcast with a colleague of mine who is now a teacher. So I will not say his name on air, but a very good guy. And we basically went back and forth and chronicled our experiences as both cannabis writers and my mental health experience in improving it, and showing what could work, what didn't work, what might work. As well as I've had a couple of interviews with my wife as well as showing some of the collateral damage that people that poor mental health can instill. And so Burning Bush was my way to tell that story. And now I've been interviewing industry professionals and all that about how they use cannabis. And as my plant medicine exposure increased, I've changed the idea behind the podcast slightly. It's expanded from beyond cannabis to all plant medicines, and so now I try to educate people about that type of stuff. And I have a couple episodes coming up. One, I have an interview with a hemp grower out of Southern Oregon, the Plain Jane founders. And also an interview with one of the guys in the From Shock to Awe documentary, which is about a couple of Iraqi war veterans who used ayahuasca to help them recover from PTSD.
That's great. Well, so yeah, we're going to talk and dive into your journey, how you used ayahuasca and MDMA and psilocybins, and as well as your journey into yoga and running, active cannabis lifestyle, and kind of what strains worked, and as well as recommendations for some folks going through similar stuff. But first, let's dive into your day job. You work with the Arizona Department of Health Services with their medical marijuana program. Is that right?
No, they're one of the resources that I use.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
My day job is I am a copywriter for Item 9 Labs, which is a cannabis wholesaler. It's a cultivation wholesaler down here in Arizona. Let's just say I didn't have steady work for a while when I first got off my meds and was on cannabis all the time. I had some trouble finding jobs that would really work with my recovery type thing. Fortunately, one of the founders there was, let's just say, familiar with my journey. Because I share a lot online on Instagram about what I'm going through and how things are going. And he saw something and brought me on to be the voice of their company. And so now my job is to gather data, both research data from AZ Department of Health or other groups, and industry data, and explain that in a way that people can understand. So they can be shown how cannabis can help them deal with their issues.
Hello.
Hey, buddy.
How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, brought some Arizona weather with you to Seattle. I appreciate that.
Oh, is it nice up there right now?
It's a beautiful day, man. Yeah, much
Very
needed.
cool. Yeah, it's like it's been in the 80s, and I think it was 106 yesterday here. So
Yeah. That's fairly dry though, right?
oh, it's super dry. It's not as it doesn't feel like in Seattle I can go outside until about the mid 90s, and then I start to just drop. Here 110 is about the limit of where you really start to, it really starts to 107 really starts to feel hot.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, humidity for me, like 72 in the Northwest is a lot. You know, low 70s, you start feeling that, you know, I need some shorts or whatever. Portland always seemed warmer. Did you notice that when you were living down there?
always, yeah, it was always 5 or 10 degrees warmer in Seattle is what it felt like every single time. I don't know why, but it always did. Maybe ocean distance was my guess.
Yeah, sounds about right. It's
Yeah.
a concrete jungle in Portland.
Yes, yeah, yes, it is compared to Seattle for sure. And here it just gets hot and stays hot forever.
So catch me up to speed over the last couple of years. I remember we were dabbing out at the Northwest Cannabis Club when I first got that Evo inhaler from Sebo Shin down in San Francisco. Sent one up when I was trying to launch the Seattle Superconda Cafe before the felony in Washington. So we were dabbing in Portland. Catch me up to speed.
Let's see. Well, let's be honest. I had a mental breakdown.
Now, have you been pretty vocal about that? I mean, your podcast is about cannabis and mental health.
Yeah. I've been. I don't think. I think when I say mental breakdown, people are like, "Oh, so you had a couple of tough days." I'm like, no. My entire the life that I thought I had led was sort of cracked in many places. So I realized that Portland was full of triggers for me, and so I turned to cannabis full time, and then got off my psych med that I've been using for about 16 years, which were one of the main reasons behind the breakdown, because I was on Lexapro, which after a couple of years starts to really get to you. I turned completely to cannabis, stopped my meds in June of 2016, and then have spent the past 4 years trying to rebuild life. I went from using cannabis full time to adding psychedelics, most particular ayahuasca and magic mushrooms, to my healing regimen, added yoga, and have gone from crazy ranting high guy on the internet to I'm back to writing now. I wrote for Dope for a couple of years. I am a copywriter now for Item 9 Labs, which is a nice cannabis company down here. And I am still in the industry, just sort of writing and helping people understand how better to use medicine. I also volunteer, quasi-volunteer. So there's some compensation at an ayahuasca with an ayahuasca group that helps people with mental health challenges. A lot of times it's trauma or PTSD type of things. I help them sort of break through, and using all plant medicines. And so it's been fascinating. And cannabis was a gateway to more substances, but it was a gateway to health and wellness instead of heroin and meth or some harder drugs that would have destroyed my life. So yeah, it opened me up, and I gotta say, I am a whole different person now, and it's hard to describe like how much that is, but just I talk differently, I speak differently, I act differently. It's been fantastic. So,
did you ever know Allison Drayson from the Ames Institute when you were in Seattle?
I know that name, but I never met Allison.
Okay, because she's been heavily involved with psychedelics as a use for mental health, PTSD, and depression, and just whatever, getting out of a funk. A mutual friend of ours had given me some psilocybin, some magic mushrooms, low dose, microdose, and I didn't really know what to think of it. I have done mushrooms, but I always did an eighth at a time, and it was a crazy trip, you know, where posters are talking to you. Whoa. So when I did a microdose of mushrooms, I realized it was kind of like coffee. Like I was like, I got to go do a podcast. I've got to go, get this done and that done. And it's really focused, but you don't have like that caffeine withdrawal or the tiredness afterwards. I did feel dehydrated more than normal, but I found it very interesting. What's What's been your experience with psychedelics? How'd you start?
I started with, well, I mean, I had ecstasy back in college. So I don't know if I really, ecstasy is sort of, is a lot of times used in different healing things, but I had ecstasy back in college in a non-healing thing. I took it to go to a club and it was amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, what happened was really is I moved here in 2017, in January 2017, and things didn't get any better for a while, even though I was still using cannabis and I was still doing yoga. I was still argumentative. And so my wife basically said, you have to get better now. I was like, oh shit. So I had heard of ayahuasca, and a war photographer had talked about using ayahuasca because he said he had never been in battle, but he had seen the aftermath of battle. And so he goes, I couldn't get the pictures of all the bodies out of my head. And he goes, it was hard to talk about because I hadn't actually been traumatized. He's like, I wasn't shot at or beat up or anything like that. He goes, but I saw all this other stuff. And he goes, I couldn't get out of it. And ever since I had been diagnosed with complex PTSD in May of 2016, I realized that the trauma that I had experienced was similar to that, of where you didn't have any scars necessarily, any physical scars, but you had mental scars. And so I just kept reading about it and reading about it and reading about it. And I found out in February of that year that there was actually an ayahuasca church in Portland, right down the street from where I lived at the time. But I had found a group in the desert outside of Tucson that does it. And from everything I read, I wasn't looking to get high, even though I don't have any problem with people who use psychedelics or cannabis just to get high. That's great. Like, I get it. I was looking to see if there's some sort of healing thing, and everything I read that this happened. And so I checked it on Reddit, went down to this intentional community, sort of a Burning Man type community in the middle of a desert about 20 miles outside of Tucson, and in a tent, and drank fermented vine and leaves with 30 other people. And it's the first day it sucked. Nothing happened. All I saw was I saw a snake around a mountain hissing at me because I was riding an eagle. And it basically said, if you want to get to the top of the mountain, you have to go from the beginning. You have to go from the very bottom and go through all the catacombs and all the maze. And I was like, what the fuck? I just want to get high and have fun. Like, what is this bullshit? The second night, all I had was pain, which I understood now to be somatic flashbacks. And then I went home and everything was different after that. I started to see the world as it really was. I started to see myself as I truly am. And then I went back a couple days later on the next Saturday, and I had a breakthrough that I could only describe as a religious experience. That's the closest thing I can think of as a religious experience, an awakening to a world beyond who we think we are, but also that we're actually part of all of that. And I did, and after I had sat with ayahuasca, I had used cannabis every single day from, I don't know, early 2016. And I'm talking every single day, meaning like I was drinking infused smoothies in the morning, drinking infused smoothies in the lunch, drinking smoothies in the evening, smoking at the cannabis club at night. Like, I had a lot of cannabis, and I went cold turkey and just didn't need it for 2 months. Just didn't need it after trying ayahuasca. And I was like, this is fantastic. I love this. This is amazing. And then it started to crumble after 2 months. And so I went back to cannabis and I was stabilized a little bit. And then a buddy introduced me to microdosing psilocybin. And microdosing was the key, because what it did is it just took a little bit of the sadness away and gave me some energy to do things. Like you just said, it's like a cup of coffee without the caffeine. And that's really what it was. It just took, it's like I didn't realize I had an anchor on me. And once that anchor was sort of taken off, I just flew. And so, yeah, I've been experimenting with different amounts, different types of magic mushroom strains. And I became a sort of a helper facilitator for ayahuasca groups down here in Tucson, I'm in Phoenix. And yeah, now I consider plant medicines as sort of a holistic approach to feeling better. It's been awesome.
So there's been a lot of interest in psychedelics. There's been a couple of companies that have gone public, I think in Canada.
Yep.
maybe even the OTC markets in the US. And there's been an acquisition recently too, where a cannabis company acquired a psychedelic company. So you have people that are involved, guy from Shark Tank, Kevin O'Leary, and some other folks. What have you found from all of your trials over the last 3 or 4 years? What works? Is it the MDMA, or is it the microdosing, or was it the ayahuasca? Like what's a good regimen?
They all work for different things. MDMA is best for couples counseling. So if you have, let's say, have issues with your spouse, maybe you have complex PTSD and you've been screaming for years, and not always at your spouse, but in the area, and she or he has trust issues with you because you are, crazy to them. MDMA it does a great job of facilitating conversations between people. It allows both sides to open up. It allows both sides to feel safe. I had read many studies and had talked to a psychiatrist who was doing MDMA assisted counseling in office down in Casa Grande, which is right between Phoenix and Tucson. And so I decided to do that with my wife and I, and it opened up. It wasn't, people a lot of times think of MDMA as this like, oh, you're going to take it, you're going to want to get all sexual and rub yourself and dance and all that. That can be part of it. But for me, it was much more of a sensual experience, much more of an emotionally and intellectually intimate experience of where we just sat and talked for 5 hours. That's really what it is. I mean, my wife and I had a counseling session together facilitated by MDMA, and that's what it was. The reason that I wouldn't take it more often is because MDMA really drops your serotonin levels. There's a big dip in the next week or two, which makes a lot of the other problems that I was trying to deal with much harder. Ayahuasca feels like psychedelic surgery, in that if you have an acute issue or some sort of long-term issue you can't quite get rid of, you go there for a weekend, you go for a couple days. And what happens is you're sort of guided. There's a spirit guide of sorts. This might sound crazy to a lot of people, but there's a guide. There's something there that's showing you the way. And what it does, it shows you connections between different things in your life and allows you to understand that you're doing X because of Y, but you're doing Y because of Z, and you're doing Z because of A. And understanding all those connections, usually they're throughout time. And for me, they're always throughout time. It's like, oh, well, I'm mad about this. I also reacted like this when I was 20. I also had an incident when I was 11. And then, I remember when I was 4 too. Oh my God. So this isn't actually 4 separate incidents. It's just me repeating the same thing from when I was 4 years old. And it was a huge eye opener into the version of me that could have happened had these things not happened, or I had fixed these things earlier in my life. And so basically said, if these things hadn't have happened or had you dealt with them, you'd be able to do this now. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. So I just had to figure out how to react to that. For mushrooms, for me, they work best as a soft reset. So if ayahuasca is an inpatient surgery, we are going under anesthetic. Psilocybin or magic mushrooms is more of an outpatient surgery where you have maybe a local and then you're out in that day. You can't go as deep, you can't do as much, but you can get some of the same experience. And then the microdoses allow you to integrate what you've learned from the deeper dives, in that, if you need to get up every day and do yoga or do meditation or something, healthy to sort of focus your mind, the psilocybin makes it a little bit easier to do that. It helps you overcome some of the years of learned resistance you have to those type of things. So they all are used quite differently for me, and I like that I'm able to sort of space all them out that way.
Mm-hmm. You've done a lot of research too, and experiments on yourself with cannabis, as I kind of pivot to your other role. Even going back to 2016, you were kind of one of the first people I knew that were actively using cannabis for a lifestyle, an active cannabis lifestyle. You were running, you were exercising, you were doing yoga and cannabis, different strains, you were documenting and writing about it, compiling all of that. What have you found? What worked, and what would you recommend?
The key here for anyone who wants to do this is you have to have access to tested cannabis. If you don't have cannabis with test results, it won't work, because if you don't know exactly, or not exactly, but if you don't know, if you're not pretty sure of the top 3 terpenes, top 3 cannabinoids you're interacting with, you can't. The notes you take aren't going to matter at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that was key. I first realized that stuff was working when I had strains that were high in THCV, which tends to be Durban Poison has a lot of THCV, Dutch Treat, and a lot. I mean a percentage of a percent.
Relative.
Like THCV doesn't take much, like 0.1% type stuff. What happened was I was actually at the club, at the Northwest Cannabis Club, and someone said a sarcastic comment to me that hit me a lot deeper than it should have. It felt like I was being made fun of as a little kid.
Mm.
And I'd had some Durban Poison. I turned to someone and I went, "Hey, wait, oh my God, I'm having a flashback, right?" I realized I was having a reaction to a previous thing in the moment.
Mm.
And had finally figured out and then went to research, and THCV helps people with PTSD stay in their bodies during flashbacks. So you still have a lot of the images and a lot of the feelings, but you don't actually get transported back to that time where you'll lash out and freak out. And that was that was a huge key. And so after that, I started to eat more cannabis for. I'm not really sure why. Oh, it's because I was saving my already vaped bud, because I was vaping a lot, and I had borrowed some from the club too, because they had their already vape bud from their volcano. I started eating it, and I noticed that if I ate cannabis at night, my mood was improved in the morning. I didn't freak out when I woke up. And so I found that hybrids at night, I would stay away from sativas unless I was looking to get triggered and work through some things. And then indicas during the days were a best thing. I found out that strains like Gorilla Glue made me dance. Strains like Larry OG made me cry. And strains like Durban Poison actually triggered me and made me want to act out in ways that I didn't necessarily want to have happen. But once I was able to understand that and sort of forecast that, it was a huge step into being able to figure the stuff out on my own. So what I did is I started to eat more cannabis, and by eating more cannabis, I mean infusing oil or flour into coconut or MCT oil and adding it to food, and started taking it on a regular basis at regular times, just like you would any sort of medication. And it just smoothed things out. It made what would be very volatile mood days into sort of smooth days that you could really deal with.
Hmm. What about some of the exercising, the running you were doing and the yoga? Weren't you pairing that with cannabis strains as well?
I started with running. The running thing I figured out because I was trying to figure out that I had read somewhere about runner's highs, and I had read that that long distance runners were using cannabis during runs, and I was like, why would you smoke? And they were smoking joints like in the middle of runs, and I was still in this weird place because I grew up as an undiagnosed celiac. And so I had runners-induced asthma until I was 31. And so I always thought that it was smoking and burning things that was causing my lung issues. And it may have been a little bit, like when I was smoking cigarettes. I smoked cigarettes from my 20s. But after a while, I realized it wasn't. And so I read that they were using cannabis on runs. And I was a runner. Turns out I was self-medicating via running because running was making me feel better. And I read somewhere, I don't know where it was, they said something about the runner's high, the chemicals in a runner high is the same as the chemicals in a cannabis high. I was like, oh, that's an interesting thing to think about. How would I test that? Okay, great, let's test it. So I'd run enough that I knew that I got my runner's high about 40 minutes in, between 40 and 45 minutes in, depending on the day and how far I was running. So I decided, I don't feel that great. Let's try and dab before I go out running. Let's see what happens. And so I would take some Agent Orange, and I would dab it in my Dr. Dabber and go out running. And I realized after about 3 days of this, it was really quick, that the high that I got in the beginning was the exact same high that I got at 40 minutes in. And so what I was doing is I was basically making it more fun for my body to work out by getting high early. I was just bringing in the runner's high earlier. And so I experimented a little bit further with that and thought, well, I wonder if eating cannabis can do something with that, because I know eating is better for me. So I would dab a little bit, I would eat a little bit and dab a little bit. And if I timed it right, I would have a runner's high when I ran out the door. So that makes that first mile a lot easier, because I know that any runner knows the first mile is one of the toughest, because getting warmed up and getting out of the house and sort of breaking into that sweat and all that, it's the toughest. If you get past the first mile, it's much, much easier. So I would dab and I would feel fantastic for the next 30, 40 minutes. And then my runner's high would kick in. I would also feel fantastic. And then the edibles would kick in about 60 to 90 minutes. So right after I finished or right in the middle of long runs. And I would keep on feeling fantastic. And what happens is my anxiety was the point of where it hurt my stomach and I would have to use the restroom a lot. And the days that they used more cannabis before I ran, the less likely I would have to stop in a restroom. And in Portland, thankfully, I had restrooms everywhere, but they're not always the cleanest. And so the more I would use cannabis for running, the less likely I would have to stop in a restroom on my way. And it made just the running experience a lot of fun. When I came back to Arizona, there were a group of ladies called the Medicaid Mavens offering infused yoga. Essentially, we were in somebody's backyard up in North Phoenix.
Oh, dope.
Everyone had a joint. There was a volcano with a bag passed around. One guy brought a bag and an extension cord. And so we were passing that around a little bit before class. And so we would just do yoga. And I was like, wow, this is really similar to running, except I'm not having to hurt my joints and all that type of stuff. And I did the yoga. I did yoga a couple times, and then my local yoga studio offered $100 for 100 days. And so I started going in the mornings, and I would take my dad before yoga class and go into yoga, and I would be able to work through feelings that came up during my experience. And so what happened is if you read The Body Keeps the Score, there's a lot of literature that says that trauma is stored in our bodies. Like we remember trauma based on where we feel it in our bodies. And so as I was stretching and doing my downward dogs and all my different yoga poses, is I had remembered traumatic experiences throughout my life that I could then breathe through and tell myself I was safe. And it just opened up a whole bevy of healing options. So essentially it was, because I had trouble meditating, because every time I sat alone with my thoughts, I'd freak out, like anyone with trauma usually does. And so I realized, oh my God, running was my meditation. I was meditating while I was running. I was zoning out and doing that. Yoga can do that too. And so I turned more to yoga, and that's only because my hips started to go, because I'm not old, but I was 30 something years old, and I hadn't been doing enough weight training to really keep it up. My body started to break down. And so I was like, oh crap, if I can't run as much, then I definitely want to keep up being active. So I switched more to yoga. And then I started incorporating magic mushrooms into yoga as well, and noticed that I could pinpoint exact things. There was one time I remember I was doing some shoulder stretch, and I was like, oh man, that hurts. I wonder why this hurts so much. And immediately I was flashed back to a time when I was 13 years old, or 13 or 14. I was playing Little League, and I was throwing the ball, and I hadn't warmed up, and I threw a ball from the outfield, and something in my shoulder snapped. I never thought about that because it didn't hurt. It just sort of something tore partially. And I'd realized that what happened is my body had healed from that, but it never really fixed the area. And it was this sort of fascinating thing about all these things I was reacting to may not have been in the moment. I was reacting to things that had happened before, and it all sort of built up in the moment.
Do you remember particular strains that you wanted to stay away from, or anything that helped achieve that? that you were looking for?
Anything that was majority indica was better for me personally. While I loved sativas, Durban Poison, Jack Hare, Candyland. God, there's another one that I really liked. When I think of it, I'll tell you. The high sativas, similar to how I use caffeine, got me amped and excited and everything like that, but they made everything a lot harder for me. They made my brain work better, like my intellectual side work better, but they hurt everything else. And so I realized that I can still have them, but I have to have them in moderation. I have to be prepared for what's going to happen. As far as indicas, a lot of OGs, anything that's very, if you think of a very dank, very couch locky strain, those are the ones that felt really good to me. But in a weird way, they didn't actually couch lock me. They actually made me more active. So I was more likely to use an indica before running than I was to use a sativa, because the indicas actually made me want to be more active than instead of a typical couch lock, which really surprised me.
Have you found that other people with ADHD also have like an opposite effect with indica?
Yes. Yeah.
That's so weird, because the same thing happens with pharmaceuticals.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Any theory behind why that is?
I think that for me, what happens with stimulants is they overwhelm me and tire my brain out. It's sort of similar to if you've ever used electroshock therapy, but those TENS units that they electrodes you put on your back or muscles, and they shock you a little bit, and they try to tire your mind out, tire your muscle out. That's sort of what sativas do to me. Or they in the right dosages they do to me. So they'll calm a little bit, but I would think that we're just sort of, our body is aching to freak out because we're used to freaking out, because when we get upset and we get bothered, our body releases endorphins and other chemicals to make us feel better. So I think we're almost chasing a dopamine type high with that. Is the only way we feel better is to get really, 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 really amped up, because all of a sudden, because until then we're misfiring, and then we become all even as we speed up. But the problem is, then you're going 100 miles an hour. And do you have any experience at driving 100 miles an hour? I don't know. And that's, it just, because before I used caffeine a lot too. And I actually stopped that when I stopped my meds as well. So it was a very similar thing. I think we're just used to it. I think I just thought that being anxious and being activated and having all that stuff was part of how I was supposed to feel. And our bodies sort of get accustomed to that type of thing. For me, dealing with ADHD type stuff, understanding the root cause of it was key, because the root cause of my ADHD was complex PTSD, so it was trauma. For others, it might be a different thing. It might be strictly a chemical imbalance. It might be just a different wiring type thing. But mine was more like was more trauma based. So I was being triggered and activated rather than simply not being able to pay attention. Because sometimes I could pay attention really well, and that was really eye opening for me to understand that. Because I think a lot of people think that, yeah, I'm ADHD, stimulants calm me down, that means stimulants are helping me. And not really. I think they're just tiring us out.
What recommendations do you have for somebody who's going through similar issues with mental health, and they're using, maybe alcohol, something that they shouldn't be, or dependent upon cannabis rather than looking for a more permanent solution?
Cannabis is a tough one, because I was dependent on cannabis. I mean, that's why I turned to. I basically was dependent. I went from taking pills to being dependent on cannabis, and that's why I turned to psychedelics. You have to turn to something that's strong enough to break whatever's going on. Whether that means you meet with someone, a naturopath, a doctor who can prescribe you a certain cannabis regimen, or you find psychedelics to break you out of it. I know that one of the biggest problems I see with a lot of people in the industry right now, and a lot of patients that I talk to, is they are smoking distillate, right? They are using pens. They are using pens that are 80% or more THC, that are either flavored with organic or derived terpenes or cannabis derived terpenes. But the problem is, when you are using just THC, you're not actually using the whole plant. And the other cannabinoids are really, really, really important in helping moderate the way the THC affects us. When I understood that helped tremendously. I would think the first thing that someone can do if they're dependent on cannabis, especially, is to make sure you're using more than just THC. Add CBD to your regimen. Either that's a tincture or add a 1-to-1 type thing. If you can at least get a 1-to-1 pen, that's a start. Start using live resin pens or CO2 extractor pens with lower levels of THC, because that helps really regulate. Eat it. That was a big part. Eating it was a huge breakthrough. I think you were there on those. We had edible Fridays, something like that. We had Tuesdays. Tuesdays?
I think it was Mondays.
Edible Monday. It was Mondays. Man, my memory's going.
I think it was Mondays. Yeah.
But I always felt best the morning after edible nights, and so eating it's a huge key. And if you're looking to taper down from either alcohol or any drug, it really depends on it. The cannabis is what I use to taper off of alcohol. It's what I use to taper off cigarettes. I used to drink a lot. I was a binge drinker. I used to smoke cigarettes. I used caffeine and sugar. But cannabis is what I use, and it was only because I was able to eat it and I was able to get balanced full spectrum options with CBD in there, because it's that overall entourage effect you need, not just the THC that gets you high to make you feel better.
Right. So to clarify, you weren't eating distillate. You were eating either full extract cannabis oil or a full spectrum.
Yeah, I was taking vaped bud from other people had used in volcanoes, or I had used in my own hot box, and I was soaking that over a double boiler in coconut oil or MCT oil and adding that to food. So I was using flour. Oil is easier, but the problem is with a lot of any sort of distilled oil, they're stripping out a lot of cannabinoids while they're stripping out. That's why they have to re-add terpenes a lot of times. You're stripping out everything but THC. So I would recommend getting flour and then making your own sort of mixture from there. There's some companies down here in Arizona that I really appreciate. I found them out really, really quickly, because the edibles here are much more distillate based than they are whole flower based. And there was one company that said, "Oh yeah, we do all ours with keef." And I was like, "Oh, keef is a perfect way to do it, because it's easy to activate, it's easy to handle because there's not very much of it, and it's super potent." And so they were just cooking keef in the oven and then sprinkling it in. You don't even have to strain it, and it didn't add much flavor, if any. And that was a really cool way for me to be able to buy things off the shelf and still have them work.
Where can people reach you? Like, what's a good social media, or if somebody wants to check out your podcast, where can they find you?
Yeah, I am TD Hurst everywhere online. I am also on Instagram at the Burning Bush Podcast. You can also search the Burning Bush Podcast on iTunes. I'm there as well. Yeah, my Instagram's the best way to get a hold of me, because that I'll tell all my stories, and I'll tell all my embarrassing stories in the story section, so you can read them, and then they'll disappear forever, hopefully. But yeah, TD Hurst or the Burning Bush Podcast, just about everywhere online you can find me.
Awesome. We'll leave some links in the comments below.
Okay.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to roll this one up. I want to thank my guest, Tyler Hurst. He's the host of the Burning Bush Podcast. Tyler, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Josh. This is great.
Yeah. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is The Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't. And I'm out.
Hello, hemp friends. This is your host, Morris, from Volume Up, the Let's Talk Hemp podcast, where we explore and discuss all things hemp all the time. From industrial to nutritional to therapeutic to lifestyle, hemp has a place and a home pretty much everywhere. Download episodes now of the Let's Talk Hemp podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Come get loud with me on Volume Up as we take industrial hemp to a whole new level in 2022 and beyond.